A veteran thought his grandmother's mountain cabin was just old wood and memories, until his dog started barking at what was buried beneath the floor. In the gray rain of Montana's mountains, a lonely veteran returns to the old cabin his grandmother left behind, believing it's nothing more than a relic of the past. But when his loyal dog begins barking furiously beneath the floorboards, Daniel Brooks uncovers a secret buried for over half a century, one that will shake an entire town to its core. If this story moves you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, your city, your state, or your country. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional, true-to-life stories of veterans, loyalty, and redemption. Rain had been falling since dawn, slow and steady, whispering against the windows of Daniel Brooks's small apartment in Cedar Ridge, Montana. The kind of rain that seeps into the bones, that turns the world gray and still. Daniel sat in his worn armchair near the window, the faint smell of coffee and gun oil mingling in the air. His eyes were hollow from another night of restless sleep, nightmares that never stayed long enough to describe, only to remind him he wasn't free of them. Hunter, his shepherd Malinois mix, lay near the door, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes always alert. Every thunderclap made him twitch. Every shadow made Daniel's heart skip. Years of service had trained them both to live in the constant hum of vigilance. When the clock struck 8, Daniel stood and stretched, joints popping like dry branches. He pulled open the door view to check the weather, and froze. There, on the doormat, sat a white envelope already speckled with raindrops. No name handwritten, only a typed label. Brooks, Daniel J. In the corner, a gold-embossed seal read, Harrison and Lowell, attorneys at law. Daniel frowned. He hadn't heard that name in years. Lawyers didn't visit men like him anymore. Men who lived alone on the edge of town, who worked part-time fixing fences and never spoke about where they'd been. Hunter rose silently, ears pricked, tail stiff. The dog sniffed the damp air and gave a low growl, not loud, but enough to make Daniel's pulse quicken. "Easy, boy," Daniel muttered, but his voice came out hollow. He bent, picked up the letter, and stepped back inside, closing the door against the sound of the rain. At the kitchen table, Daniel slit the envelope open with his pocket knife. The blade trembled slightly in his hand. Inside, a folded document and a short note waited. The paper smelled faintly of old wood and something sterile, the scent of offices and forgotten estates. Dear Mr. Brooks, we regret to inform you of the passing of Ms. Helen Brooks. As her sole surviving relative, you have been named beneficiary to her property located in Silver Peak, Montana. Please contact our office to finalize transfer of ownership. Sincerely, Harrison and Lowell. He read it twice, then a third time. Helen Brooks. The name felt like a ghost. His grandmother. Or at least, that's what his mother used to call her before she died. He hadn't seen Helen since he was a teenager. Before boot camp, before Afghanistan, before all the noise and fire that had followed him home. The rain outside thickened into a sheet, streaking the window like a watercolor painting left too long in the sun. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused. Why now? Why her? He'd grown up hearing that Helen had cut ties with the family, retreating into the mountains after some scandal no one ever explained. His mother had always said, "Some stories aren't meant to be reopened." Hunter nudged his hand with a wet nose, breaking the spell. Daniel looked down at him. The dog's brown eyes were calm but alert, studying his every move. "What do you think, buddy?" Daniel whispered. "A cabin in the mountains. Sounds better than this box, huh?" Hunter gave a faint whine and looked toward the door again. For a second, Daniel thought he heard something, a car engine fading in the distance. But when he glanced outside, there was only the rain and the empty street. He folded the letter and set it on the table, but his eyes kept drifting back to it. The paper seemed to breathe in the quiet, as though it carried more than words, as though it had waited 25 years to find him. That night, he didn't sleep. The letter lay on the counter beside his old dog tags and the small bronze medal he kept hidden in a drawer. He replayed the words in his mind. Sole heir. Property in Silver Peak. Sometime after midnight, he rose, poured himself another coffee, and stared at the map pinned to his wall. Cedar Ridge sat in the valley, surrounded by endless forest and jagged ridges that stretched north to where Silver Peak lay, a name he hadn't spoken in decades. Hunter followed his gaze, tail brushing lightly against the floor. The dog's eyes caught the faint glow from the lamp, making them shimmer amber. Daniel reached down, rubbing the scar along Hunter's neck, a mark from shrapnel years ago. Guess we're both ghosts, huh? He murmured. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and the letter fluttered from the table, landing face up on the floor. Hunter growled low, then approached it, sniffing. The hair along his back rose slightly. Daniel frowned, reaching down to pick it up. The corner of the envelope was damp, but the paper inside was dry as bone. He stared at the gold seal again. Something about it, the faint outline of a mountain beneath the firm's name, felt deliberate. He hadn't noticed it before. Silver Peak, he whispered. The words lingered in the air like a challenge. By dawn, the rain had eased, but the clouds hung heavy, pressing low over the hills. Daniel packed a duffel bag with essentials: a change of clothes, a flashlight, his service knife, a first aid kit. He hesitated before taking his old sidearm, then locked it in the glove compartment of his truck. Hunter jumped into the passenger seat before Daniel even called him. The dog settled into place, one paw on the dashboard, watching the gray horizon. Daniel slipped the letter into his jacket pocket. Let's see what the old mountain's hiding, boy. As the truck rumbled down the road, Cedar Ridge disappeared in the rearview mirror. The highway stretched out before them, slick with rain and framed by pine trees bending in the wind. The radio hissed static, then went silent. Daniel drove on, feeling that old restlessness stir inside him, the same instinct that had once led him toward war and now led him toward something he didn't understand. Hunter shifted closer, resting his head against Daniel's arm as thunder rolled far away. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something he couldn't name. Not hope, not yet, but movement, purpose, maybe even fate, and beneath it all, a quiet unease, the sense that this letter hadn't simply arrived, it had been sent. The road curled out of Cedar Ridge like a gray ribbon fading into fog. Early morning light broke through the clouds in fractured beams, catching the mist that clung to the forest. The hum of Daniel's old truck filled the silence, its wipers thumping a steady rhythm against the windshield. Beside him, Ranger sat upright, head high, ears perked toward the shifting world outside. The further they drove, the thinner the signs of civilization became. Gas stations grew fewer, houses scarcer. The highway narrowed into a two-lane stretch, then finally into gravel. The smell of pine replaced the rain's cold dampness. Birds scattered from the treetops as the truck rumbled by. Ranger leaned against the window, nose twitching. Every few miles, Daniel would glance at him and see that old soldier's alertness in his eyes, the same expression he'd worn in combat zones, when every sound meant something. The dog had saved his life more than once overseas. Now, Daniel wondered if that instinct was still warning him of danger, even here. By midday, they reached a weathered sign that marked the county line. Silver Peak, elevation 6,742. The letters were half faded, the paint cracked like old scars. A second sign below it hung crooked. Road maintenance ends here. Daniel stopped the truck, letting the engine idle. He stepped out, boots sinking into damp earth. The air smelled of cedar and old rain. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. He opened the map again, a physical one, frayed at the edges. The cabin's location had been hand-sketched by the law office, a small red X at the end of a winding trail. "About 10 miles of dirt road," Daniel murmured. Ranger barked once, as if to answer. "Yeah, I know," Daniel said, half smiling. "You hate dirt roads." He got back behind the wheel, and they started up the mountain. The gravel clicked and popped beneath the tires. Around each bend, the world seemed to close in tighter. The forest denser, the light dimmer. Moss clung to the trunks like green velvet. Every so often, Daniel caught a glimpse of mist drifting between the branches, curling and reshaping like smoke. The climb grew steeper. The truck's tires skidded once, then gripped again. Daniel shifted gears, eyes flicking between the road and the tree line. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone had driven this same path recently. Tire tracks, faint, but newer than the road's last rain. Ranger noticed them too. He let out a low growl, his gaze fixed ahead. "Probably hunters," Daniel said quietly, though even he didn't believe it. As they ascended, the view opened suddenly. A clearing. The valley below sprawling like a painting of muted greens and grays. Clouds hung low, their bellies brushing the ridgeline. For a moment, Daniel parked and stepped out again, letting the silence wash over him. The quiet up here was different. Not the kind that comforted, but the kind that listened back. Ranger sniffed the air and whined softly. Daniel knelt beside him, hand brushing the dog's fur. "You smell something?" The dog's tail flicked once, uncertain. His ears tilted toward the woods, then forward again. When Daniel stood, a sudden gust rattled the branches. Something metallic clanged faintly, distant, maybe from a loose sign or old fence post. It came and went in a heartbeat, but it was enough to tighten the muscles at the back of his neck. He exhaled slowly. "We're almost there, boy. Just one more ridge." They drove the last mile in silence. The road narrowed into a trail barely wide enough for the truck, carved along the edge of a steep drop. The tires crushed gravel and pine needles alike. Ranger's gaze stayed locked out the window. The fog ahead thickened until it looked like smoke from a smoldering fire. Then, as the trees parted, the cabin appeared. It stood near the base of a cliff, surrounded by dark pines and wild grass grown knee-high. The roof sagged slightly, the porch leaning with age. Its windows were blank, reflecting nothing. A single tin chimney jutted from the roof, long rusted. Daniel killed the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening. He sat for a moment, staring through the windshield. "Well," he muttered, "there it is." Ranger barked once, sharp, alert, and jumped out of the truck before Daniel could grab the leash. The dog bounded across the clearing, nose to the ground, circling the porch. Then, without warning, he stopped dead. His body went rigid, head turned toward the front door. "What is it?" Daniel called, stepping out. Ranger growled low, teeth bared. His tail was stiff, his eyes locked on the ground near the doorframe. Daniel approached slowly, crouching beside him. Mud smeared across the wood. There, clear as day, were footprints. One set, heavy, fresh. They led out from the cabin, not in. Daniel felt the old instinct rise, that pulse in his chest, the one that had kept him alive in war zones. He rested a hand on Ranger's neck. "Stay close." He tried the door handle. It was unlocked. The hinges groaned as it swung inward, the smell of dust and wood rot spilling out like breath from a tomb. Inside, the dim light revealed a room frozen in time. Furniture draped in white sheets, a wood stove half buried in ash, walls lined with shelves of forgotten books. A kettle sat on the stove, blackened with age. Daniel stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He scanned the room, corners, shadows, exits. Everything old, still, and wrong. Ranger followed, nose working the air. He sniffed near the doorway, then along the rug, circling until he reached the hearth. There he stopped again, one paw scratching the floor. "Something down there?" Daniel asked. The dog didn't move, just kept scratching lightly at the same spot. Daniel crouched beside him. The wood beneath was uneven, one plank slightly raised. He ran his fingers along the edge, cold and rough. Beneath it came a hollow sound, faint but unmistakable. "Not yet," he whispered. "Let's see what else is here first." He straightened and took in the cabin once more, the photographs along the mantel, their glass cracked but still intact. One photo in particular caught his eye. A young woman in uniform, standing before a military office building, smiling faintly. The nameplate on the door behind her read, "Helen Brooks, Finance Division." His throat tightened. "You really were in it," he murmured. Outside, thunder rolled again, distant but moving closer. The forest shifted with the wind. Ranger gave one final bark toward the door, as if warning someone unseen beyond the trees. Daniel stared into the mist, the unease from that letter now growing into something heavier. Not fear, but the weight of being expected. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. He closed the door slowly and locked it. "We'll figure it out in the morning," he said softly, though his eyes stayed fixed on the fog outside. Ranger lay down near the hearth, head resting over that single uneven plank, unwilling to move. Daniel poured himself a cup of stale coffee from his thermos and sat near the window. The last light faded from the valley, leaving the world steeped in blue. As the wind howled through the trees, he thought he heard something. A faint hum, like a radio signal buried under static. It came from somewhere deep in the cabin, too low to trace. He waited, listening. But then it stopped, leaving only the steady rhythm of the rain returning. He turned to Ranger, whose eyes glowed softly in the firelight. "Guess we're not alone, huh?" The dog's tail twitched once. Agreement or warning, Daniel couldn't tell. Outside, unseen in the darkness, a pair of headlights flickered through the trees, paused for a moment, then vanished into the fog. Daniel stayed by the window long after the lights disappeared. The forest was a dark mass of shapes and whispers, moving only when the wind touched it. The air inside the cabin felt colder now, heavier, as if the house itself had drawn a slow breath and was waiting for him to make the next move. He reached for the lantern on the table and turned the knob. The flame bloomed weakly, casting long, unsteady shadows that seemed to stretch farther than the walls should allow. Dust floated in the beam like snow caught in amber. Ranger lifted his head. His eyes followed Daniel across the room, tracking every step. "It's all right, boy," Daniel murmured. "Just some locals, maybe. Checking on the new guy." But even he didn't believe it. The floorboards groaned under his boots as he crossed to the fireplace. On the mantel sat a row of old photographs, edges curled, glass cracked. He lifted one, brushing away the dust. A woman in her 30s stood before a plain government building, wearing an army uniform. The name stitched above her pocket was H. Brooks. "Hello, Grandma," Daniel whispered. He tried to imagine what kind of woman she had been. Strong enough to live alone up here, long enough to vanish from everyone's memory. He traced the outline of her smile with his thumb, feeling the faint tremor that came whenever his PTSD crept in. The past was never gone, just waiting for the right trigger. A soft sound drew his attention back to the floor. Ranger had risen again, ears flat, tail stiff. The dog padded toward the hearth, nose close to the boards. He began to scratch, gentle but insistent. Daniel knelt beside him. You found something, huh? The plank near the base of the fireplace was darker than the rest, swollen from years of moisture. He tapped it lightly, hollow. The sound sent a shiver up his spine. Good work, he said softly, rubbing the dog's neck. We'll take a look in the morning. He stood and checked the windows one last time before turning down the lantern. The light faded until only the faint glow of embers painted the room in red and black. That night, Daniel dreamed of footsteps in the hall, slow, measured, moving just beyond the reach of sight. He woke to Ranger's low growl, a sound that came from somewhere deep in the animal's chest. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Hey, Daniel whispered, sitting up. You hear it too? Silence. Then from upstairs, a faint thump, followed by another. Daniel froze, every muscle tightening. He reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, thumb hovering over the switch. Ranger moved first, silent as a shadow, placing himself between Daniel and the door. The steps creaked again, lighter this time, like someone moving carefully to avoid making noise. Daniel took a slow breath. Stay close, he whispered. He moved through the hallway, the beam of his light cutting through layers of dust. The staircase loomed ahead, narrow, steep, lined with old photographs that glowed dully under the light. Each face seemed to follow him as he climbed. At the top, the sound stopped. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Rust, or maybe blood long dried. He checked each room. Empty. A bedroom with moth-eaten curtains. A bathroom with a cracked mirror. A narrow study filled with books that had turned to pulp. Nothing moved. Then, just as he turned to go back down, his light caught something near the floor. A faint line of footprints in the dust. Bare feet. Small. Leading toward the attic hatch. His pulse quickened. No way, he whispered. He reached for the pull rope, but before he could tug it, Ranger barked once, sharp and commanding. Daniel spun around. The footprints were gone. The dust lay undisturbed, smooth as untouched snow. The room was empty. Still. Watching. Okay, Daniel muttered, forcing a laugh he didn't feel. I need sleep. Back downstairs, he poured himself a cup of cold coffee, sitting at the table until the sky outside turned gray. By morning, the unease had settled into something else. Curiosity. The kind that could get a man into trouble. When the first light broke over the ridge, he grabbed his knife and pried up the loose plank near the fireplace. It came up easier than he expected. Beneath it was a shallow cavity lined with old cloth. Inside lay a small tin box. Daniel lifted it out carefully, brushing away decades of dust. The box was wrapped in oil-stained paper, sealed with a strip of wax stamped with the initials HB. Ranger sniffed it, tail wagging once, then retreating as if the scent was too strong. Daniel's heart thudded as he cracked the seal. Inside were photographs, folded papers, and something heavier wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal a medal, tarnished but still gleaming faintly. A bronze star engraved, Helen Brooks, 1969. Underneath it, a letter written in neat cursive. The paper was yellowed, fragile. To whoever finds this, there are things buried deeper than this box. Truths that will not stay silent forever. They took what was not theirs, and I took what I had to keep it from being lost to men like him. If you are reading this, it means the storm has passed, and perhaps the truth can breathe again. Trust no one who carries the Cain name. HB. Daniel sat back, the words echoing in his mind. Cain. The name was sharp, familiar somehow, though he couldn't place where he'd heard it. He folded the letter carefully, setting it aside. The rest of the papers appeared to be old accounting ledgers, government forms, typed reports stamped confidential. Numbers, dates, codes, nothing he could make sense of yet. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. The cabin looked different, now, less haunted and more alive. As though by opening that box, Daniel had awakened something that had been waiting for him all along. He fed the fireplace a few pieces of wood, the flames catching with a quiet sigh. Ranger settled beside him, head resting on his paws, finally calm. "Looks like your nose was right again," Daniel said softly. "Guess Grandma left us homework." The dog blinked slowly, content, the tension gone for now. Daniel leaned back in the old chair, staring at the fire. The warmth crept up his arms, chasing away the chill. Yet even as the light filled the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out in those woods, someone else had felt that warmth flicker to life and knew exactly what it meant. Miles away, on a rain-slick road below the ridge, a black SUV slowed to a stop. The driver rolled down his window, looking toward the mountain, where a thin trail of smoke rose from a newly lit fire. He smiled faintly, then started the engine again. The low growl of the vehicle faded into the mist, leaving the forest silent once more. Up on the ridge, Daniel Brooks sat at the edge of his grandmother's cabin porch, nursing a cup of instant coffee that steamed in the cold morning air. The sun fought to break through a blanket of fog, turning the pines into silhouettes. Ranger sat beside him, watching the valley below with the kind of focus only a working dog could have. His right ear twitched every time a branch cracked in the woods. Daniel followed the sound with his eyes, but the forest stayed still. "You don't miss a thing, do you?" he said quietly, reaching down to scratch the dog's neck. "Guess we're both still on duty." The cabin creaked as it warmed under the weak sunlight. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of ash, dust, and something older, a memory that had soaked into the wood. Daniel had spent most of the night sorting through the papers from the tin box, though he'd understood little of it. The ledgers were coded, the names redacted, the kind of government work he'd seen during his years in the Marines, but never questioned. Now, with daylight creeping through the windows, he decided to take another look. He went back inside. Ranger followed close, tail brushing against his leg. The morning light filtered through cracks in the boards, slicing the room into thin gold lines. Daniel set the box on the table and began spreading its contents out carefully. Most of the documents were brittle, faded receipts, typed memorandums, even a few newspaper clippings. But one piece stood out, a folded map, its edges stained and soft. It showed the outline of the county, marked with old survey lines, and there, near the top of the ridge, was a red X beneath it. Written in faint pencil were the words, "Relief Camp, 1968. He frowned. Relief Camp. That had been the year of the floods, the disaster his grandmother's generation still whispered about. Whole towns had been washed away. He sat back in the chair, the map trembling slightly in his hands. "What were you doing up here, Helen?" he muttered. "What did you find?" Ranger barked softly, as if answering. His nose brushed the edge of the rug near the fireplace, the same spot where Daniel had found the first box. "What is it this time?" Daniel asked, kneeling beside him. Ranger scratched once, then twice, his nails clicking against wood. Daniel pulled the rug back completely, revealing more floorboards, darker and less worn than the rest. One plank near the wall seemed newer, its nails different, its edges too clean. He tapped it with his knuckle. Hollow. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. He grabbed his utility knife and pried at the shell edge. The nails gave easily, squealing as they pulled free. Beneath it lay another cavity, deeper this time, lined with tar paper. Inside was a second metal box, slightly larger than the first and heavier when he lifted it out. Ranger wagged his tail, then froze again, ears forward, nose twitching. "Easy," Daniel said softly, setting the box on the table. "We'll see what she left us." He cut the wax seal with the knife and opened it. Inside was a stack of envelopes bound with twine, a small revolver wrapped in cloth, and a photograph, black and white, edges curled from age. The picture showed Helen Brooks standing with 4 men in army uniforms. One of them was shaking her hand, a proud smile on his face. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Finance Division, Project Hope, 1968. Project Hope. Daniel recognized the name. It had been one of the post-war recovery programs meant to help veterans rebuild their lives after returning home. Billions of dollars had been allocated, and just as much had vanished in scandals and mismanagement. He opened one of the envelopes. Inside were hand-typed reports, expense authorizations, lists of transfers, signatures, and one signature appeared over and over again at the bottom. General Richard Kane, the same name from the first letter. Daniel exhaled slowly. "So that's who you were protecting yourself from," he whispered. Ranger gave a low whine, breaking the silence. He was staring at the front window now, body tense. Daniel followed his gaze. A figure was standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the mist, too far to make out details, but tall, motionless, watching. Daniel reached for the revolver instinctively, but when he looked back, the figure was gone. He stayed by the window a while longer, listening. Only the sound of the wind moving through the trees. After a long moment, he holstered the gun and looked down at Ranger. "We're not imagining this, are we?" Ranger's ears flicked back, then forward again, always alert, always ready. Daniel sat back at the table, running a hand over his face. The coffee on the stove had gone cold. He poured another cup anyway and stared at the documents again. There was something about the neatness of it all, the way every piece of evidence had been packed, labeled, hidden. Helen Brooks hadn't been afraid of being caught. She'd been preparing for someone to find it. And that someone, he realized, was him. He spent the rest of the morning cataloging each document, marking them with sticky notes from his own notebook. Years of military habit took over. Organization, analysis, planning. Each time he found the name Kane, a muscle twitched in his jaw. By noon, the fog began to burn off, revealing the jagged ridge behind the cabin. The mountain's shadow stretched long across the clearing. Daniel stepped outside, stretching his back, the sun hitting his face for the first time that day. The forest smelled different now, clean, sharper somehow. Ranger trotted beside him, nose to the ground, tail swishing. They followed a narrow path behind the cabin that wound down toward a stream. The water glinted like glass under the sunlight. As Daniel crouched to wash his hands, he noticed something half buried in the mud near the bank. A rusted license plate. The numbers were faint, but the letters still showed clearly. SP-68. Silver Peak, 1968. The year of the flood. The same year his grandmother had disappeared. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the metal in his hand, before slipping it into his pocket. When they returned to the cabin, he took one last look at the mountain above. From where he stood, he could see the faint outline of an old logging road winding upward through the trees, the same road marked with the red X on Helen's map. "Guess we're going up there next," he said quietly. Ranger barked once in agreement. Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He looked back toward the road, the one that disappeared into the valley. Somewhere down there, The man in the black SUV was probably still watching. And for the first time since the letter arrived, Daniel felt the old pulse of danger again. Not from war, but from something older, colder, and far closer to home. He closed the cabin door, locked it, and whispered, "All right, Grandma. Let's see what truth you buried up here." The wind rose, rattling the windows as if the mountain itself had heard him. By the next morning, the sky had cleared. Thin sunlight filtered through the pines, scattering gold across the forest floor. Daniel brewed a cup of coffee on his old camping stove while Ranger circled the clearing, sniffing at the air. Every so often, the dog would pause, ears perked toward the distant road below. "Relax, buddy," Daniel said. "Probably just deer." But he knew better. The feeling of being watched hadn't left him since he'd arrived. Even out here, miles from town, there were eyes. He carried his mug to the porch and leaned against the rail, surveying the ridgeline. The forest stretched endlessly, peaceful on the surface, but full of whispers underneath. He thought about the papers in Helen's box, about the red X on her map, and the name that kept appearing. Kane. The name tasted bitter in his mouth. He'd seen generals like that in uniform, men who turned duty into power. And now that name had followed him here. A sound broke through his thoughts, the low rumble of an engine climbing the gravel road. Daniel turned toward it, squinting into the sunlight. A sleek black SUV emerged from the trees, its paint gleaming like oil. It stopped at the edge of the clearing. Ranger's growl was immediate, deep, warning, the kind that carried memory. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in an expensive coat that didn't belong on a mountain road. His hair was silver, his face tanned and lined, but his eyes, sharp, pale blue, gave nothing away. "Mr. Brooks?" he called out, voice smooth and practiced. Daniel didn't answer. He set the coffee mug down and let his hand rest on the porch railing, close to his sidearm. The man smiled faintly. "Name's Alan Kane. I believe this property once belonged to your grandmother. Helen Brooks?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's right. I used to know her," Kane said, stepping closer. "Long time ago. I heard someone finally came up here. Thought I'd stop by and welcome you to Silver Peak." Ranger barked once, sharp. Kane glanced at the dog with mild distaste. "Fine animal. Shepherd Malinois, right? Military breed?" Daniel didn't answer that either. Kane kept smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Beautiful place up here, though isolated. Can't imagine it's much fun alone." "I like quiet," Daniel said flatly. "I can tell." Kane adjusted his coat, pretending to admire the view. "You know, my company owns most of the land on this ridge. Been trying to clean up the old lots for development. Your grandmother's property is right in the middle of our new project." Daniel folded his arms. "And?" "Well," Kane said smoothly, "I'd like to buy it from you. Save you the trouble of dealing with taxes, repairs, that kind of thing. Mountain houses are dangerous. Weather, animals, isolation. Things happen." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Not interested." Kane's smile tightened just slightly. "You sure? We can make it worth your while. A generous offer, no questions asked." "Not selling." Ranger moved forward, planting himself between them. Kane's eyes flicked to the dog again, then back to Daniel. "Suit yourself," he said softly. "But if you change your mind, I'll be around." He turned back toward the SUV but paused halfway. "Your grandmother was complicated," he added. "She had a way of getting mixed up in things she didn't understand. I'd hate to see that happen to you." Daniel said nothing. He watched Kane get into the SUV, the engine humming to life. As the vehicle reversed down the narrow road, Ranger barked twice, not out of fear, but defiance. When the forest was silent again, Daniel exhaled slowly. "Well, that confirms it," he said. "They're still guarding something." He went back inside, pacing. The words from Helen's letter echoed in his head. "Trust no one who carries the Kane name." By dusk, the calm of the morning had turned into unease again. A storm rolled in fast, wind scraping across the cabin roof. Daniel closed the shutters and fed the fire. Ranger lay near the door, ears twitching with every gust. Thunder cracked somewhere over the ridge. Then, faintly, over the roar of the wind, an engine again. Daniel grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch. Rain had started to fall, light but cold. Through the trees below, two beams of light cut across the darkness, weaving up the same road Kane had taken earlier. "Damn it," Daniel muttered. The lights stopped halfway up the hill, then turned off. Total darkness. For a long minute, nothing. Then the faint crunch of footsteps on wet gravel. One set. Moving slowly, deliberately. Ranger growled low. Daniel stepped back inside, locking the door and dousing the lantern. The cabin sank into shadow. He moved to the window, peering out through the crack in the shutters. Nothing but rain and the blur of trees. He waited. Another minute passed. Then came the sound. 3 quick knocks on the wooden door. Daniel froze. Ranger's fur bristled. A voice followed, muffled by the storm. "Mr. Brooks? It's me again. Alan Kane." Daniel said nothing. The voice continued. "Sorry to bother you so late. Thought I'd left something behind earlier." Still no reply. The handle turned slightly. Locked. Kane chuckled softly through the door. "Always prepared, aren't you? Military men usually are." Then silence. The sound of footsteps retreating into the rain. Daniel waited 5 full minutes before opening the door a crack. The clearing was empty. No SUV, no footprints, already washed away by the storm. He stepped back inside and looked at Ranger. If he wants something, he'll be back that night. Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat near the fire, the revolver resting on his knee, staring at the map Helen had left. The red X at the summit burned in his mind. Outside, lightning flashed across the ridge, revealing the black SUV parked just beyond the tree line. Its headlights were off, but Daniel could see the faint orange glow of a cigarette burning behind the glass. Whoever sat inside didn't move for hours. When dawn finally broke, the SUV was gone, leaving only tire tracks in the mud and a single bullet casing on the porch, gleaming in the morning light. Daniel picked it up. The engraving on the base read one word. "Kane," Ranger barked, the sound echoing into the forest. "Yeah," Daniel whispered, turning the casing over in his palm. "Now it's war." The morning fog still hung thick over the clearing. Dew glistened on the grass, and the smell of wet pine drifted through the open window. Daniel set the casing on the kitchen table beside the map and exhaled. His coffee had gone cold again, but he drank it anyway, staring at the empty spot on the porch where the SUV had been parked hours earlier. The forest felt quieter than it should. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Ranger paced by the door, restless, ears twitching with every groan of the wind. His right paw still bore an old scar from combat, a thin white line that caught the light when he moved. Daniel knelt, rubbing the dog's shoulder gently. "You've been through worse, huh?" "Me too." He stood and moved to the old roll-top desk in the corner of the room. The drawers were swollen shut from moisture, the varnish long gone. He pried the first one open and found nothing but dust, a few rusted pens, and a faded photograph of Helen Brooks sitting on the porch of the same cabin, the porch he now stood on. She looked younger, strong, smiling faintly at something out of frame. In the second drawer, beneath a stack of brittle papers, he found it. A leather-bound notebook tied with string. The cover had cracked with age, the edges darkened from oil and years of handling. Across the front, in small gold letters barely visible in the light, it read, H. Brooks. Daniel untied the string carefully and opened it. The first page was dated March 1968. The mountain is quiet tonight. Too quiet. They came asking questions again. The committee wants more signatures, more forms, more silence. But I know what they're doing. They think no one will notice the missing accounts. They think I'll look the other way. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should. But I can't. Daniel flipped the page. Her handwriting was sharp, controlled. The kind of script you learn when you've spent years behind a typewriter and filing cabinets. The relief fund isn't reaching the veterans it was meant for. The numbers don't add up. I traced the transfers. They go through shell accounts, companies owned by Kane's associates. When I asked questions, I was told to forget it. I won't. He leaned back in the chair, running a hand through his hair. Jesus, Grandma, he murmured. You were sitting on a bomb. Ranger sat at his feet, eyes following every movement as Daniel turned another page. If anything happens to me, I've hidden proof. I'll keep the files here. They can call me a thief, a liar. It doesn't matter. The truth will outlive me. Daniel looked toward the window, the sunlight barely cutting through the haze. He felt something heavy in his chest. Pride, sorrow, maybe both. You were braver than any of us, he whispered. He flipped deeper into the notebook. The tone of tone, the entries began to change. He came again today, Kane, smiling that same smile, telling me to sign off on the report. He said it's not about right or wrong, it's about loyalty. I told him I'd seen loyalty, in the faces of men who lost everything while men like him got richer. He didn't like that. They'll ruin me. I know it. They've already started. But I can't leave yet. The money isn't gone. I moved it before they could. Someday, someone will need it to finish what I couldn't. Daniel's throat tightened. He flipped to the final page. The date was November 3rd, 1968. The snow is coming early this year. I don't think I'll make it to town again. The papers are sealed. The map will show the rest. If anyone ever finds this, tell them I wasn't running. I was guarding what mattered. The last line trailed off, the ink smudged by what might have been water or tears. Daniel closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. He looked around the cabin, at the sagging beams, the cracked stove, the dust floating through thin shafts of light. You stayed up here all alone, he whispered. All this time, and no one ever knew. Ranger whined softly and padded toward the door. He scratched at the wood once, then looked back. What is it? Daniel asked, following. The dog's nose was pressed against the lower crack of the door, tail stiff. Daniel grabbed his rifle and eased the door open. Nothing. Just the forest breathing. Still, he stepped onto the porch, scanning the trees. A raven cried somewhere in the distance. The sun had climbed higher now, the mist lifting to reveal the trail that wound down toward the valley. Something shimmered near the edge. A reflection, brief but bright, like sunlight glancing off glass. He lifted the rifle's scope. There, parked halfway down the hill, the black SUV again. No movement inside, but the driver's window was down. A gloved hand rested on the sill, motionless. Watching. Daniel lowered the rifle, jaw clenched. Persistent bastard. He turned back inside, shut the door, and locked it. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, charged with tension. He sat again at the table, pulling Helen's map closer. At the top of the ridge, the red X glared like a wound. Next to it, faintly written, a note he hadn't noticed before. When they come, go higher. Ranger pawed the floor beside him, restless. Daniel rubbed the dog's ear absently, thinking. That night, the wind shifted. He could smell rain in it, or maybe snow. Ranger didn't rest, pacing the floor, ears twitching at sounds Daniel couldn't hear. Every now and then the dog stopped to stare at the window, his reflection merging with the darkness outside. Daniel tried to focus on the journal again, flipping through the middle pages. One passage caught his eye. Frank Doyle doesn't know I've kept copies. He's a good man, but scared. They all are. Kane told him to keep his mouth shut or lose his pension. I don't blame him. Everyone's afraid of the powerful. But someday, fear won't matter anymore. Frank Doyle. The name stirred something in Daniel's memory. He remembered hearing about a Sergeant Doyle when he was in the Corps, an old-timer who'd worked supply back in the day, retired years ago. He jotted the name down in his notebook. Guess we've got someone to find, he said to Ranger. The dog tilted his head, tail giving a slow, expectant wag. Daniel smiled faintly. Yeah, I know. We'll go soon. But first, we find the rest of what she hid. He tucked Helen's journal into his duffel and checked his sidearm. The mountain outside was quiet again, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that comes before something breaks. As he blew out the lantern, a gust of wind slammed against the wall. For just a second, he thought he heard it. A woman's voice, faint as the rain. Don't stop now. He turned sharply, but the room was empty. The fire crackled once, throwing sparks that danced across the wood floor, landing by chance on the open notebook. For an instant, the gold letters of Helen's name glowed in the light before fading back into shadow. Daniel stared at it for a long time, then whispered, I won't. Outside, down the road, the SUV's taillights blinked once in the darkness, like an answer. The next day passed under a washed-out sun. Clouds drifted low over the ridge, heavy with rain that refused to fall. Daniel spent the morning sealing the broken window frames and reinforcing the old cabin door with spare wood. Ranger followed him from room to room, tail low, eyes sharp. The dog hadn't barked once all day, not a good sign. It meant he was listening. By mid-afternoon, Daniel finally allowed himself a break. He sat at the table with Helen's journal open, rereading the pages about Sergeant Frank Doyle. The entries painted him as decent but frightened, a man who'd known too much and said too little. Daniel scribbled a note on a torn envelope. Find Doyle. He didn't know yet how, but the name gave him something to focus on. Focus was how he'd survived the Marines, and how he'd managed to keep his demons quiet. The radio on the counter crackled to life with faint static, an old battery model he'd found in one of Helen's cabinets. A voice cut through for a second, too faint to make out, then faded. Daniel frowned, adjusting the dial. Static again. Then a single word broke through. Watching. He froze. What the hell? He leaned closer, but the sound was gone. Ranger lifted his head, a low rumble in his chest. Daniel turned the radio off and set it aside. Probably interference, he muttered. But the words didn't sound convincing even to him. The air outside had changed, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Long shadows stretched across the clearing, painting the cabin in amber light. Daniel grabbed his jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The forest smelled of wet bark and pine resin. In the distance, thunder rolled softly across the valley. He walked to the edge of the clearing, scanning the slope below. The road was empty, silent. but something glinted in the dirt. A scrap of paper, flapping against a rock. He picked it up. A single line scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. "Stop digging, soldier." Daniel's grip tightened. The note was damp, but fresh. The ink hadn't bled yet. Whoever left it had been here recently. He looked around, every sense sharpened. But the woods were motionless. Ranger growled from the porch, ears flat. Daniel's voice was low, calm, controlled. "Inside, boy." They backed into the cabin. Daniel closed the door, bolted it, and checked his rifle. Years of training returned. Short, efficient motions, no wasted breath. He extinguished the lantern, leaving only the faint glow of the fireplace. Minutes passed. Then a sound, faint, deliberate, footsteps on gravel. Not from the road this time, but from the side yard. Someone circling. Ranger's growl deepened. Daniel crouched by the window and peeked through a crack in the shutters. A shadow moved near the tree line. Not fast, not slow. Searching. He reached for the radio and turned it on again, keeping the volume low, nothing but static. Still, it filled the silence enough to steady his pulse. The footsteps stopped. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. Then, tap. Something struck the wall. Light. Testing. Daniel raised the rifle, aiming at the door. "If you're looking for trouble," he muttered under his breath, "you just found it." A flash of lightning illuminated the room for a split second, long enough for him to see something on the door. A smear of red. Blood. He stood slowly and pressed 2 fingers to it, still wet. "Someone's hurt," he whispered. Ranger whined, glancing toward the back of the cabin. The dog's instincts said move now. Daniel followed, stepping into the kitchen. The rear window was cracked open, a sliver of air slipping through. It hadn't been that way earlier. Outside, the forest had gone black except for the last glow of dusk. The trees swayed, whispering secrets to one another. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and pushed the door open. Rain began to fall in thin, cold lines. He swept the beam across the ground. Footprints. Small ones, lighter than his own. Fresh. They led away from the cabin toward the massive pine tree at the edge of the property. He followed cautiously, Ranger close beside him, paws silent on the wet earth. As they neared the tree, the beam caught something metallic. A shell casing, half buried in the mud. Daniel picked it up and turned it over. The same engraving. Cane. He pocketed it and aimed the flashlight higher. The tree bark was scarred, torn as if something or someone had been dragged against it. Then he saw it. A smear of blood leading down to a patch of disturbed earth. He crouched. The soil was loose, recently moved. "Someone was here last night," he whispered. "And they didn't leave by choice." Ranger sniffed at the ground, then lifted his head sharply, ears pointed back toward the cabin. A faint creak echoed through the rain, the sound of a door slowly closing. Daniel spun around, flashlight sweeping across the clearing. The cabin door now stood half open, though he was certain he'd latched it. His pulse kicked hard. "Come on," he said quietly. They moved quickly through the mud, slipping on the wet ground. When they reached the porch, the door was still ajar, swinging in the wind. Inside, the fire had gone out. The room was dark. Daniel raised the light. The table was a mess. Papers scattered, drawers open, his duffel turned over. The journal was gone. "Damn it!" He slammed his fist against the wall. Ranger sniffed the floor, circling, then stopped near the doorframe. A small object lay there, a dog tag, old and tarnished. Daniel picked it up. The letters were barely legible, but one name was clear. Frank Doyle. How the hell? He stopped. Whoever broke in hadn't just taken Helen's journal. They'd left him a trail or a warning. Maybe both. He slumped into the chair, gripping the dog tag tight. Outside, thunder cracked again, rolling down the mountain. Ranger rested his head on Daniel's knee, eyes fixed on the window. Lightning flashed, revealing the silhouette of the forest, and for a brief second, the faint reflection of headlights far down the slope. Daniel didn't move. His voice, when it came, was quiet but cold. "All right, Kane. You've got my attention." The rain came harder now, drumming against the roof. Inside, the light from the dying fire flickered once and went out completely, leaving only darkness, and the steady sound of Ranger's breathing beside him, loyal and unshaken. By morning, the storm had passed, but the damage was done. Papers soaked through, muddy footprints across the floor, drawers overturned. Daniel spent the first hour cleaning up, his movements sharp, deliberate. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Ranger's eyes followed him, understanding more than words ever could. The dog tag sat on the table, its tarnished metal glinting in the pale light. Frank Doyle. "Looks like we're taking a trip," Daniel said quietly. He packed the essentials, his sidearm, Helen's map, the notes he'd copied from her journal before it was stolen, and enough supplies for a few days. Ranger hopped into the truck bed as if he already knew the plan. The mountain road wound downward through mist and pine, sunlight slicing through in silver beams. Daniel drove slowly, scanning the tree line. Every turn felt like a test, every shadow a watcher. When the road finally widened into the valley, he reached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, a scattering of old storefronts, faded signs, and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. The nursing home sat at the edge of town, surrounded by oak trees and quiet. Its sign read Silver Pines Veterans Care Center. Daniel parked out front. The air smelled of cut grass and antiseptic. Ranger jumped down beside him, tail swaying slightly, but alert. Inside, a nurse greeted him with a cautious smile. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm looking for a resident," Daniel said. "Name's Frank Doyle. Used to be Army. Supply Sergeant, 1960s. The nurse glanced at the sign-in sheet, then up at him. "You family?" "No," Daniel said. "But we served under the same flag." Something in his tone softened her expression. "Room 12B, down the hall to your left. He doesn't get many visitors." Daniel nodded his thanks and started down the corridor. The smell of disinfectant grew stronger, mingling with the faint sound of a television playing some old western. When he reached 12B, the door was cracked open. Inside, an elderly man lay propped against a thin pillow, eyes closed, a blanket tucked neatly under his arms. His hair was white, his face marked by time and something deeper. Guilt, maybe. Daniel knocked lightly. "Sergeant Doyle?" The man's eyes opened, cloudy but alert. "Haven't been called that in a while," he rasped. "Who's asking?" "Daniel Brooks," he said, stepping closer. "Helen Brooks was my grandmother. I think you knew her." The old man's face went still. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glasses. "Helen," he whispered. "She's gone, isn't she?" Daniel nodded. 25 years. Frank swallowed hard. "I always hoped she'd forgive me before she died." Daniel pulled up a chair. "Why don't you tell me what happened?" Frank stared out the window for a long moment before speaking. "We were part of the relief committee after the flood of '68. You've read about that?" Daniel nodded. "They put me in charge of inventory. Supplies, funds, payroll. Helen handled the accounts. She was the only honest one among us." His voice shook slightly. "Kane was running the show. Colonel back then, later a general. He used the chaos to line his own pockets. Fake contractors, ghost shipments, all of it. Helen found out. Frank coughed, the sound dry and harsh. She confronted him during one of the meetings, told him she'd turn over the records. I told her not to. I told her it wasn't worth it. He looked down at his hands. Next week, the papers ran a story. Relief funds stolen by bookkeeper. Just like that. She vanished after that night. Daniel leaned forward. And you knew she didn't do it. I knew, Frank said. But I didn't have the guts to say so. Kane had me by the throat. Promised he'd strip my pension, ruin my family. He reached slowly under his pillow and pulled out a small leather notebook, worn thin, pages yellowed. I've been waiting for someone to come for this, he said, handing it over. My record of every meeting, every lie, every signature. Daniel took it carefully, his chest tight. Why hold on to it all these years? Because she told me to, Frank said, his voice trembling. The last time I saw her, she said, one day, someone in my family will need the truth more than my name. Guess that someone's you. Daniel opened the notebook. The entries were short but damning. Dates, initials, transaction codes, amounts diverted from veteran aid to shell companies. One entry stood out. November 2, 1968. Meeting in closed office. HB confronts RK, voices raised. Mention of threat. Blood on Kane's hand. Daniel looked up sharply. He hurt her? Frank nodded slowly. Not bad enough to kill, but bad enough to make her disappear. She left that night. Said she'd hide what she could before he found it. Ranger whined softly, pressing closer to Daniel's leg. Frank's eyes softened at the sight. Good dog you've got there. The best, Daniel said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. Then Frank's hand gripped Daniel's wrist. His eyes were clearer now, sharp despite the years. You have to finish what she started. Kane's not untouchable anymore. His son runs things now, Alan. Same blood, same sins. Daniel nodded. I intend to. Frank let go, his arm falling weakly to his side. Tell her I'm sorry, he murmured. Daniel hesitated. I think she already knows. When he stepped out of the nursing home, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. He stood for a while, breathing the clean air, the weight of Frank's notebook heavy in his jacket pocket. Ranger trotted ahead toward the truck, tail wagging. But halfway there, he stopped. His body stiffened, nose lifting toward the road. Daniel followed his gaze. A dark sedan sat parked across the street, engine idling. The driver wore sunglasses, face expressionless. When Daniel met his eyes, the man put the car in gear and pulled away. No license plate. Daniel exhaled. They're still watching. He opened the truck door. Ranger jumped in, settling beside him. As they drove out of town, Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror. The sedan was gone, but the unease remained. He reached over and rested a hand on Ranger's back. We're close now, buddy. She hid the truth up there, and we're gonna find it. The sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the valley in orange light. The road wound upward again, back toward the cabin, back to where it all began. By the time Daniel parked, dusk had fallen. He stepped out into the cool mountain air, the last light flickering across the trees. The cabin stood silent, the forest holding its breath. Ranger jumped down, landing softly beside him. Together they walked to the porch, where a single piece of paper fluttered against the doorframe, pinned with a hunting knife. Daniel pulled it free. The message was short, written in black marker. This is your last warning. He looked at the knife, the make and model military issue, something only a man like Kane would use. Daniel's jaw clenched. No, he said softly. "This is yours." He tossed the knife into the dirt and turned toward the cabin. Behind him, Ranger stood at full attention, tail rigid, eyes on the tree line. The forest had gone too still again. Daniel felt that silence sink into his bones, the kind of silence that used to hang in the air before ambushes overseas. He knew it well. It was a silence that listened back. "Inside," he whispered. Ranger obeyed instantly, slipping through the door ahead of him. Daniel followed, closing it quietly and dropping the bolt. He stood still for a moment, listening to the wind against the roof. It carried the faint smell of smoke, but not from his chimney. He turned to the table where Frank Doyle's notebook lay open beside a half-burned candle. The writing was cramped, shaky, but unmistakable. Helen's name appeared again and again through the final pages, intertwined with numbers and account codes. Each line was a small piece of history clawing its way out of the dark. And there, tucked between two brittle sheets of ledger paper, was an envelope Daniel hadn't seen before. Thin, sealed, and yellowed with age. On the front, written in looping handwriting that stopped his breath, were the words, "For Daniel." He froze. His full name, Daniel Brooks, spelled out in the same cursive that had filled Helen's journal. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal. Inside was a single page, folded 3 times. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "My son, if this reaches you, it means you've found what I hid, and the truth I carried alone. I couldn't be your mother in the open. They would have found you, and I would have lost you twice. So I became someone else, a name safer than love. But I watched from afar when I could. You had your father's eyes, but the quiet was mine. There are things blood remembers, even when the mind forgets. If you wish to understand, look not for what I took, but for what I protected. The truth isn't buried in gold or papers, it's in who you are. Forgive me." Daniel read the letter twice, then let it fall to the table. His vision blurred. "No," he whispered. "That can't." He ran a hand over his face, trying to steady his breath. The room tilted slightly around him. Ranger pressed against his leg, sensing the tremor in his hand. "She wasn't my grandmother," Daniel murmured, voice rough. "She was my mother." The words sounded foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. He sat down heavily in the chair, the letter trembling in his hands. Memories he'd buried long ago, an old photograph, a voice half-remembered, the absence of answers every time he'd asked about his parents, rose like ghosts. "She gave me up to keep me safe," he said, almost to himself. All this time. He looked around the cabin, the home she'd built in exile, the silence she'd endured, the walls that still whispered her name. "You didn't just hide the truth, Mom," he said softly. "You lived your whole life protecting it." The fire cracked suddenly, startling him back to the present. Ranger's ears shot up. The smell of smoke had grown stronger, too strong now. Daniel rose and checked the window. A dull orange glow flickered between the trees to the south. He grabbed his rifle. "They're burning something." Outside, the night air bit cold against his skin. Down the slope, through the dark pines, flames licked upward from what looked like a pile of papers, or boxes, scattered across the dirt. Someone had torched them and left in a hurry. Daniel descended carefully, rifle raised. The firelight cast long shadows over the clearing, over boot prints that led away toward the trailhead. The tracks were fresh. He crouched near the edge of the flames. The papers were almost gone, but one charred scrap clung stubbornly to life. He lifted it with a stick, fanning away the embers. It was a photocopy of a birth certificate. His birth certificate. The same handwriting, the same date, but the name under mother read, Helen Brooks. Under father, The line was blank. Daniel stared at it until the paper crumbled to ash. Behind him, Ranger barked sharply, 1, 2, 3 times. Warning. Daniel spun around. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the firelight. Tall, broad, wearing a dark coat that shimmered with rain. "Who's there?" Daniel called, raising his rifle. The man didn't move. "Step into the light." Still nothing. Then, slowly, the figure lifted something, a cigarette, and the brief flare revealed a face Daniel had seen before. Alan Kane. "Put the gun down, Brooks," Kane said, his tone calm, almost paternal. "We don't need to do this." Daniel didn't lower it. "You've been breaking into my cabin, leaving notes, threatening me." "I think we do." Kane took one step forward, hands raised slightly. "I'm not your enemy. Not really. You're standing in the middle of a very old mess your mother created. I'm here to clean it up." "By burning evidence?" Daniel snapped. Kane's smile was faint and cold. "By preventing history from repeating itself. Helen Brooks was a good woman once, but she stole something that didn't belong to her." Daniel's laugh came out short, bitter. "You mean she stole the truth?" "Truth doesn't matter to men like me," Kane said simply. "Power does." Lightning flashed across the ridge, throwing their shadows high against the trees. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Ranger growled, a deep, primal sound that cut through the thunder. Kane glanced at the dog. "Fine animal. Shame he's following the wrong master." Daniel tightened his grip. "Leave him out of this." Kane's tone softened, dangerous in its calm. "I'm giving you one last chance, Brooks. Walk away. Take the money she left and disappear. You won't survive what's coming next." Daniel lowered the rifle barrel slightly, eyes locked on Kane's. "You're right," he said quietly. "But neither will you." Kane's smile vanished. He flicked the cigarette into the mud and stepped back into the trees. Within seconds, his shape melted into darkness, leaving only the smell of smoke and the crackle of dying flames. Daniel exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold. Ranger pressed close against his leg, muscles tense. "Yeah," Daniel muttered. "I think it's time to finish this." He stamped out the last embers and headed back toward the cabin. Inside, the single candle on the table had burned almost to the wick. The room was dim, the shadows long and alive. He picked up Helen's letter again, tracing the words, "Forgive me." The ink had bled slightly from the rain, turning the lines into something softer, almost human. Ranger lay beside his chair, breathing slow and steady, one paw over the rifle strap as if guarding it. Daniel looked out through the cracked window at the ridge above. He knew what waited there, the red X on Helen's map, the place she'd called where the truth sleeps. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, he would climb Silver Peak and finish what she started. He reached down, resting a hand on Ranger's shoulder. "We end this together, boy." Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor, his eyes never leaving the dark outside. The storm broke again around midnight. Lightning flashed, illuminating the photograph on the mantel. Helen Brooks in her uniform, a faint smile frozen in time. For the first time since Daniel arrived, her eyes seemed to look back at him. The rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like distant gunfire. Daniel sat awake, the rifle resting across his knees, sleep nowhere near him. Every flash of lightning painted the cabin in stark white. Every rumble of thunder shook the windows. Ranger stayed beside him, ears twitching with each sound. They'd been through worse, both of them. Sandstorms, firefights, nights spent waiting for something to break the silence. But this was different. This wasn't war. It was personal. At 1:47 a.m., Ranger's head shot up. He growled low, deep in his throat, and moved toward the window. Daniel's instincts kicked in before his mind could catch up. He grabbed the lantern, turned the flame down to a thin blue whisper, and peered through the gap in the shutters. The road below glowed faintly in the rain, slick and black. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, there, two faint headlights at the bottom of the hill. They didn't move. He whispered, "We're not alone." He waited. 1 minute. 2. The lights stayed there, idling like predators' eyes in the dark. Then the first sound hit him. A pop, distant but unmistakable. Not thunder, an explosion. Daniel turned sharply toward the ridge. Through the rain, a sudden orange bloom lit up the trees. "Fire," he said under his breath. "They lit something." Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent. Daniel snatched his jacket, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and bolted out the door. The rain came sideways, cold and stinging. Down the slope just beyond the clearing, he saw it. Flames crawling up the side of the cabin's old woodshed, hungry and fast. Gasoline. They'd poured fuel along the wall and lit it. The bastards wanted to burn him out. "Back inside!" Daniel shouted. But before he could retreat, another flash erupted near the porch, a second trail of fire, snaking toward the cabin's foundation. "Ranger!" he called. The dog bounded through the door as Daniel grabbed a blanket from the porch rail, soaked it in rainwater, and slammed it over the creeping flames. The fire hissed, but it wasn't enough. Smoke was already pushing through the cracks in the floorboards. Inside, the air was thickening. Daniel dropped to his knees, coughing. "Basement! We need to get out the back!" Ranger barked once, leading the way. Together they ducked into the narrow hallway, smoke curling above their heads. The floorboards burned hot underfoot. Daniel's pulse hammered. He kicked open the trapdoor at the end of the hall, the small crawlspace where Helen had once stored her supplies. The air there was damp and cold, and it opened to the slope behind the cabin. Ranger slipped through first. Daniel followed, dragging himself into the mud as the heat flared behind him. He rolled onto his back, just in time to see the cabin's front windows burst outward, flames exploding into the night. "Damn it," he whispered hoarsely. Ranger limped toward him, his right paw bleeding where a shard of glass had cut it. Daniel's heart clenched. He tore off his sleeve and wrapped it around the wound. "You're all right," he said, voice shaking. "You're all right, boy." The dog whined softly, but stood tall beside him, smoke swirling around them both. From the ridge above, an engine roared. The SUV again, headlights flashing once before vanishing into the trees. Whoever had set the fire was gone, confident the blaze would finish the job. Daniel stared at the burning cabin, the only piece of his family left, and something inside him cracked open. All the quiet, all the restraint he'd clung to since leaving the Marines, vanished in that orange light. "This was her home," he said through gritted teeth. "And now it's ours to avenge." He rose, gripping the rifle until his knuckles went white. The flames reflected in his eyes. By dawn, the fire had burned itself to ashes. The cabin was a black skeleton of what it had been. Charred beams, collapsed roof, the scent of wet smoke thick in the morning air. Daniel walked through the wreckage in silence, every step crunching on broken glass and burnt memories. He found the spot where Helen's photograph had hung. Gone now, consumed. But something silver caught his eye among the ashes, the edge of the metal box he'd unearthed days ago. He crouched, brushing the soot away carefully. The box was blackened, but intact. Inside, a few of Helen's papers had survived, the ink smudged but readable. One sheet in particular bore a line in Helen's familiar hand. "If they destroy what I built, let them. The truth lives higher than flame." Daniel looked up at the ridge towering above the ruins. The red X from Helen's map, Silver Peak. She meant it literally, he whispered. That's where it is. Ranger whined softly beside him, his leg still bandaged but steady. Can you climb, buddy? Daniel asked. The dog wagged his tail weakly. That's my boy, Daniel said, his voice thick with pride and pain. He packed what little survived: the box, Frank's notebook, the revolver, and the rifle. Then he turned one last time to the cabin. The morning sun pierced through the smoke, painting gold over black. He raised his hand in a silent salute. Rest easy, Mom. I've got it from here. As they started up the mountain trail, Ranger limped beside him, every step deliberate but unwavering. The wind carried the smell of smoke down the valley, a warning and a promise. Halfway up the ridge, Daniel stopped to look back. The ashes shimmered in the light like snow, and for just a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the clearing, a woman in uniform, watching over what remained. He blinked, and she was gone. He tightened the strap on his pack and started climbing again, each step slower but stronger. The truth waited at the top, and he wasn't about to stop now. The morning air thinned as Daniel and Ranger ascended the ridge. The world below shrank to mist and silence. The trail was steep, the rocks slick from the night's rain, but they pressed on. Somewhere up there, beyond the last line of pines, Helen Brooks's truth still waited to be heard. By the time they reached the plateau, the sun had cleared the fog. The view stretched for miles, Silver Peak's summit overlooking the valley, the river, the faint outline of Cedar Ridge in the distance. Daniel set down his pack and wiped the sweat from his brow. Ranger limped, but stayed beside him, panting softly, tail wagging weakly. Almost there, buddy, Daniel said. One last climb. At the far end of the ridge stood the remains of a small outpost, a crumbling concrete bunker half swallowed by roots and moss. The U.S. Army emblem was still faintly visible on its rusted door. The lock had long since corroded. Daniel pushed it open with his shoulder, and the metal screamed in protest. Inside, the air was stale, metallic, filled with the scent of oil and decay. Dust motes drifted in the beam of his flashlight, tables overturned, filing cabinets dented, papers scattered like leaves. Looks like this is where she hid everything, he muttered. He moved toward the back wall, where a row of filing drawers stood. Most were empty, but one had been sealed shut with tape. He tore it open. Inside lay folders stamped classified, financial reports, personnel rosters, military requisitions, all marked Project Hope. As he thumbed through them, one name appeared over and over: General Richard Kane. Every document tied Kane to the diverted funds, transfers disguised as relief payments, payouts to shell corporations, all of it carefully catalogued, all of it signed. Daniel's chest tightened. You did it, Mom, he whispered. You really kept the proof. Behind him, Ranger whined low. What is it? Daniel turned and froze. At the mouth of the bunker stood Alan Kane, framed by sunlight, a pistol steady in his hand. Impressive, isn't it? Kane said calmly. She spent her whole life keeping that secret. And for what? To hand it to you so you could destroy your own peace? Daniel stayed perfectly still. You torched her cabin. Kane smiled faintly. Collateral cleanup, same as it's always been. But you've become a real inconvenience, Mr. Brooks. Daniel's voice was low. You don't have the guts to pull that trigger. Oh, you'd be surprised, Kane replied, taking a step closer. My father taught me everything about cleaning up messes. He made this town what it is. All I'm doing is protecting his legacy. Daniel's eyes flicked to the shadows behind Kane. Movement. A silhouette shifting in the light. Someone else was with him. Another man, younger, holding a camera or phone. You're recording this? Daniel said. Insurance, Kane said. Proof that I gave you a chance to walk away. Daniel's pulse slowed. He'd seen this pattern before. Men who thought control was permanent, who mistook fear for power. He dropped his tone to a whisper. You're already on record, Kane. Everything you've done. The files, the transfers, the witness statement from Sergeant Doyle, all of it's with the state police. Kane's smirk faltered. You're bluffing. Daniel held his ground. Am I? For a long moment, neither moved. Then, a sharp click, not from Kane's pistol, but from Daniel's side. Ranger had stepped forward, teeth bared, growl rising like thunder. Call him off, Kane warned. I won't, Ranger lunged. Kane fired. The shot echoed like thunder through the bunker. Daniel dropped to one knee beside Ranger before the second shot came. The dog had taken the bullet high in the shoulder. Blood darkened his fur. Ranger! Daniel shouted, his voice breaking. He pressed his hands against the wound. The dog's chest heaved, his eyes wide but steady. Kane backed toward the door, gun shaking slightly now. I told you to walk away! Daniel's fury erupted. He surged forward, grabbing Kane's wrist. The gun went off again, the sound deafening inside the concrete room. They struggled, boots scraping, fists slamming against metal. Kane swung wildly, but Daniel caught his arm and drove him against the wall. You killed her once, Daniel growled, voice raw. You won't bury her again. Kane tried to bring the gun around, but Daniel slammed his forearm into his throat, forcing him to drop it. The weapon clattered across the floor. Daniel pinned him, breathing hard. Call your men off, Daniel said. Kane spat blood. You think anyone's coming for you? This town still believes the Brooks name stands for theft. Not after today, Daniel said. Not after the truth comes out. He stepped back, leaving Kane gasping against the wall. Ranger whimpered softly. Daniel knelt beside him again, whispering, Stay with me, boy. We're almost done. He pulled his phone from his pocket, its cracked screen still glowing with a weak signal. He opened the file-sharing app and uploaded the scanned documents he'd copied from Helen's archive. The progress bar crawled forward agonizingly slow, but it reached 100%. The files went straight to a contact labeled Sheriff Dalton. Kane saw it too late. What did you do? Daniel met his eyes. I just told the world what really happened in 1968. By the time the first sirens echoed up the ridge, Kane had fallen silent. He sat slumped against the bunker wall, staring blankly as officers pulled him to his feet. Daniel didn't watch. He was too busy carrying Ranger in his arms down the mountain, one step at a time. The dog's weight was heavy, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on Daniel the whole way. Hang on, buddy, Daniel whispered. You saved me again. At the base of the ridge, paramedics waited. They took Ranger first, loading him carefully into the back of the truck. Daniel stood outside, soaked in rain and ash, staring at the ridge where the fire had once burned. That evening, as the storm cleared, the town gathered at the Veterans Memorial in Cedar Ridge. News had already spread. The files, the arrest, the confession. A podium stood under a large canvas awning, its flag illuminated by floodlights. When Daniel stepped up to speak, his arm was bandaged, his voice hoarse but his stance unbroken. Ranger lay at his feet, stitched but alive, a faint limp in his step. 60 years ago, Daniel began, a woman was accused of stealing from the very people she served. She was called a traitor, a liar, and a thief. Her name was Helen Brooks. She was my mother. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She didn't steal anything, he continued. She saved what little honor this town had left when the powerful tried to take it. And she paid for that truth with her life. Daniel lifted the small, burned metal box in his hand. the one he'd rescued from the fire. This belonged to her. Inside were the ledgers that prove what she fought for, and who destroyed her name. I'm here to make sure none of it gets forgotten again. He looked up, eyes meeting the faces of veterans, townsfolk, even the children in the front rows. The truth may take time, but it always finds its way home. The audience stood in silence. Then, slowly, applause began to spread. Hesitant at first, then thunderous. Daniel stepped back, his throat tightening. Ranger barked once, tail wagging weakly, as if punctuating the moment. Somewhere in the crowd, an elderly woman wiped tears from her face and whispered, "Helen Brooks is finally free." Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah," he whispered, "she is." The applause faded slowly into the mountain wind. The flags above the memorial fluttered against the soft blue evening sky. For the first time in decades, the name Helen Brooks wasn't spoken in shame, but in reverence. As people began to disperse, several veterans approached Daniel, shaking his hand. One of them, an old man with medals pinned to a worn jacket, said quietly, "Your mother had more courage than any of us. You did right by her, son." Daniel nodded, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. "I just finished what she started." Beside him, Ranger lay with his head on his paws, still recovering from his wound, but refusing to rest. His eyes followed every movement of his handler, protective as ever. When the last of the crowd drifted away, Daniel sat at the base of the memorial, tracing the names etched in the bronze plaque, names of men he'd served beside, names that had followed him home in his nightmares. Among them, newly engraved, gleamed one more: Helen Brooks, 1927 to 1999, honored for truth and service. He rested his palm against it, whispering, "We made it, Mom. You're home now." The sun dipped behind the ridge, washing the valley in gold. For a while, neither man nor dog moved. 6 months later, the mountains had changed. Spring melted the snow into streams that glittered down the slopes, and what had once been blackened ruins was now a place of quiet rebirth. The rebuilt cabin stood proudly where the old one had burned, its walls clean, windows shining. The sign above the porch read, "Helen Brooks, Veterans Haven." Inside, the smell of pine and coffee filled the air. The living room, once a place of ash and silence, now buzzed softly with life. Laughter from visiting vets, the low hum of conversation, the scrape of mugs against the table. On one wall hung Helen's photograph, restored and framed, next to a new one. Daniel and Ranger standing at the memorial, shoulder to shoulder. Daniel poured coffee for a group of young veterans who had just arrived from town. "It's not much," he said, smiling, "but it's quiet. You'll find peace here if you're looking for it." One of them, a Marine barely in his 20s, nodded. "Sir, peace is all we're after." Daniel clapped his shoulder. "Then you're already halfway there." When they left, he stepped outside onto the porch. Ranger followed, limping slightly but stronger every day. His prosthetic brace gleamed in the sunlight, a gift from the same sheriff's department that had honored him as a service animal of valor. Daniel leaned against the porch rail, staring out at the valley below. Birds sang through the trees, and somewhere in the distance the river shimmered like silver ribbon. "You did good, old boy," he said, scratching Ranger behind the ears. "We both did." The dog tilted his head, tail thumping against the floorboards. A voice behind him broke the quiet. "You really rebuilt the place, though," said Sheriff Dalton, stepping up the porch steps. The man looked different now, not burdened, but proud. "Town's been talking about it for weeks." Daniel smiled. "Guess I couldn't leave her story unfinished." Dalton nodded toward the sign. "You know, there's a waiting list already. Folks want to come here, not just vets, people who've lost their way. You've done something good, Brooks." Daniel looked back at the mountains. She wanted this. A place that heals instead of hides. Dalton hesitated, then handed him a folded envelope. One last thing. Thought you should have this. Inside was a handwritten letter, postmarked weeks earlier, from the county courthouse. The first line read, "In recognition of Helen Brooks's integrity and sacrifice, her record of service is hereby fully restored." Daniel smiled quietly. "Took 60 years, he murmured, but she finally got her name back." Dalton tipped his hat. Some debts take time, but the good ones always get paid. When the sheriff left, Daniel sat on the steps, the letter in his lap. Ranger lay beside him, chin resting on his boot. The late afternoon light poured over the valley, warm and endless. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of pine, smoke, and rain. The echoes of war, the ghosts of betrayal, the ache of loss. They were still there, but quieter now, manageable. He looked down at Ranger, whose eyes were half closed in the sunlight. "You saved me more times than I can count," Daniel said softly. "Guess we both made it home after all." The wind carried a whisper through the trees, faint but familiar. It sounded like a woman's voice, gentle and sure. "I never left you, Daniel." He smiled. "I know, Mom." As the sun sank lower, the cabin glowed in its light. From a distance, it looked almost like the old one. Except now, laughter replaced silence, and hope had taken root where ashes once lay. Daniel rose and walked toward the flagpole near the edge of the property. The stars and stripes rippled in the breeze, and just beneath it, a smaller plaque read, "Dedicated to those who stood when others turned away, and to the dogs who never stopped standing beside them." He stood there for a long moment, the mountain air cool on his face, Ranger sitting tall beside him. When he finally turned back toward the house, the valley below was bathed in a soft orange glow, the kind of light that made even scars look beautiful. Daniel smiled, his voice barely a whisper. "We made it, Mom. We both came home." Ranger wagged his tail and leaned against his leg as the camera of the world pulled back. The rebuilt cabin, the waving flag, the mountain standing timeless and proud. Above it all, the last light of day broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the ridge. Fade out. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, let us know. Drop a simple 1 in the comments if you were moved by Daniel and Ranger's journey home, or a 0 if you're still holding your breath after that ending. Your comments keep these stories alive, and they mean more than you think. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next tale of courage, loyalty, and second chances. There's always another story waiting, and sometimes it begins with a single bark in the dark.